Okay, welcome back. This is our enemy tutorial continued, 7.2. We're going to add some chase to our enemy. So just to review really quick, if this is our enemy, or let's say this is our player, and this is our enemy, the way, and our enemy is kind of patrolling on their little path. Okay, so they're going back and forth down this path here. Um, the way we're going to see is, the way we're going to switch to a chase is the enemy is going to have a little trigger, and if the player enters the trigger, the enemy is going to switch from patrol mode to chase mode. And then I think what we'll do is if the player exits the trigger, we'll switch back to patrol mode. Okay, so this should go pretty quick. We just need to add a trigger and some chase mechanics. So first, let's go to our enemy. I'm going to click on this enemy, and I'm going to add a sphere collider. So I'm going to click add component on the enemy, add sphere collider. So you can see we have this little sphere collider now. So what I'm going to do is I actually want to move it. So I want to move it in front of the enemy. And so remember, this blue local arrow is the front of the enemy. Okay. So I'm going to move it in the Z, which is the blue arrow. I'm going to switch it to 1.2. And so notice now this little sphere is now in front of the enemy. I'm also going to increase the radius because I want it to be able to see further to 5. So notice that kind of re-encapsulated the enemy. Let's move it a little bit further. So let's move it to, I'd like to leave a little bit behind it. So like if you get too close to the enemy from behind, they can see you. So let's switch it to 4.3. Okay, so like if you get too close behind the enemy, it's going to turn around and get you. But for the most part, you're safe if you sneak behind them. So there's our enemy. Also, in order to make it more clear which way the enemy is facing, let's give the enemy a little nose. So I'm going to right click on enemy, go to 3D object and cube. That's going to add this white cube to the enemy. And let's rename it nose. Let's go to materials, drag pink onto the nose, and then let's switch to the scale tool. Scale it a little bit down, move it up and forward, and give that enemy just a little pink nose there. Yeah, just scale it about 0.1, 0.1, 0.2, and position it at 0, 0.45, and 0.5. Just about there. And now our enemy has a funny little nose. I'm going to drag it out a little further. And so now we can see that the nose is pointing down the blue arrow, so we know which way the enemy is facing. Okay. The other thing we need to do is on the sphere collider, we need to set it to trigger, right? This is a trigger. We don't want this to bump into anything. Okay, so we have all that set up. So now let's go back into our enemy code. So I'm going to go to scripts, open up enemy, make this bigger. Okay, so we have our patrolling set up, but we don't have our chasing set up. So chasing is going to work very similar to patrolling. What we're going to do is actually, instead of turning towards the waypoint, we want to turn our, I'm going to add a comment here, turns the enemy toward the waypoint. So instead of turning the enemy towards the waypoint, we want to turn the enemy towards the player when you're chasing, right? So let's select all this and then do Control-C or right-click and go to copy. And then in our chasing, we can right-click and go to paste or Control-V. So now, instead of turning towards the waypoint, we want to turn it towards the player. So instead of looking at the next waypoint, we're going to look at, and if we go up to our properties, we have here transform player. Now transform player hasn't been set to anything yet, so we need to do that in just a second. Sorry. But now we can set the enemy to look at the player instead of the next waypoint. Okay, so that'll be the first thing. The next thing we want to do is we want to make our character, our enemy, move forward. So we're going to say controller to get the character controller and use the move method. We're going to make it move forward. So transform.forward times chase speed. So notice I'm going to scroll up a little. So here's the last time we did walk speed. Now we're going to do chase speed. We need to add gravity still. So vector 3 dot up times negative gravity times time dot delta time. Okay. Oops. Actually, I'm going to delete that time dot. Excuse me. Delete that time dot delta time for a second. Let's encapsulate everything in this method inside two more parentheses, and then multiply that times time dot delta time, and that'll just make sure that time dot delta time affects our whole motion direction, not just the gravity one. Okay. And a semicolon to end that line. So now we are moving towards the player. So that's going to be good enough for now. So we have our chasing, we have our patrolling, but we don't. Nothing ever actually ever sets chasing to true, right? Chasing starts out as false, and nothing ever sets it to true. So we're always just going to be patrolling. So the way we're going to set it to true is using our handy dandy on trigger enter method, and we're going to use our on trigger exit method. Okay. So on trigger enter, first we need to check to make sure it's the player. So if other, oops. So here's a good a tip. So other dot, and I don't get anything right. I'm just going to finish it because I haven't memorized. But just a quick little lesson. Let's talk about this. So notice we're getting an error here. Other.gameObject.tag doesn't exist because other doesn't really exist unless we say it does. If we look at our whole script, other doesn't exist anywhere else. So where are we getting this from? Well, that's our argument, right? So collider other, and that's where other comes from. So honestly, we can name this to collider. I don't know, Pikachu. And so as long as we change other to Pikachu, this reference is the same. All this collider is all this is a name, and its type is a collider, and it's an argument for on trigger enter, which is whatever enters the trigger. So I like to use other because it's like an other object, right? It's something else. So let's copy this with Control C and paste it inside on trigger exit. Since we're going to check to see if the player's leaving, and again we get our error. I'm going to say collider other in the arguments up here, right? So on trigger enter and on trigger exit. Yeah. So when we enter, we want to switch to chasing, right? So we're going to say chasing equals true. And what that's going to do is, up in our update, if chasing is true, we're going to run the chasing method instead of the patrolling method. And the other thing we need to do is we don't have a reference to the player. This player is never set to anything. So this is going to come back as null or nothing, right? It's going to equal null, which means nothing. So what we need to do is when the player gets near, we'll just set the player then. So we're going to say player, and that's our transform player. This is what we set up, equals other dot transform. Okay? And player is a transform, so we need to set it to a transform. So now we can assign our player when the player actually gets close. We don't need to worry about it until then. When you exit the trigger, we're just going to say chasing equals false. Okay? Great. So let's test this out. Let's go back to Unity. Hit play. So for the player now. Oh, shoot. Ah! Fell off the edge there. I didn't realize they were going to find me so quick. So let's see if we can sneak around behind them. Okay. Now they spot me. I'm running. Ah, can I get away? Ah, got away. So I caught them on this collectible here, and they went back to patrolling, right? So there they go patrolling again. I walk in front. Ah, they spotted me. So notice they don't attack or anything. They are pushing me though. It's a little aggressive. So they can push me off the edge, I guess. But yeah, for now, the enemy is working. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to use that to an effect, right? But for now, our enemy is nice and set up with their free wavelengths. So 0.0, 1, and 2. Great.